And thank you all for joining us in this two-part webinar series on gun violence in the Western Hemisphere. Many thanks to Keith Martin and to Norma and the CUGH team for getting this together as part of this special series of webinars this week. And really am delighted to have an opportunity to introduce three wonderful speakers to get us started on describing the scope and nature and challenges of gun violence in the Western Hemisphere. And without further ado, I want to introduce them to you before we get started. We're going to have them each present 12 to 15 minutes of their work, and then hopefully, and with that, have some questions and answers for the participants at the end of the presentation. And hopefully then you will also stay with us for the second part of this two-part webinar talking about solutions for gun violence in the Americas. Our first presenter is Dr. Laura Vargas. She is an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Colorado Department of Psychiatry. She is funded by the NIH in minority health and health disparities, and is researching exposure to trauma and mental health of recent immigrants from Latin America and the Caribbean in the United States. Specifically, her research focuses on understanding how phenotypes of depression, anxiety, and PTSD are shaped by traumatic experiences, individual characteristics, and symptom severity among adult immigrants. Her past research focused on qualitative and quantitative methods to study relationship between widespread community violence and healthcare services and utilization in Mexico. Our second speaker is Matt Schroeder. He is a senior researcher at the Small Arms Survey, where he studies the arms trade, arms export controls, and the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons. He's previously served as a director of the Arms Sales Monitoring Project of the Federation of American Scientists. Matt is the author of numerous small arms survey publications on arms trafficking in the Western Hemisphere, including Pathway to Policy, Firearms Trafficking and Public Health in the Caribbean, which was just released a few days ago, and also Trends in Trafficking, comparing U.S.-based firearms trafficking in the Caribbean and Latin America. He has also written for Arms Control Today, Defense News, Defense Technology International, Disarmament Forum, Foreign Policy, and Jane's Intelligence Review, among other publications. He holds a bachelor's degree in history, as I do, I think it's really great, from Wittenberg University, and a master's degree in international security policy from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Finally, our third speaker is Eugenio Weigand Vargas, and he's a researcher specializing in firearms trafficking and firearm violence affecting Hispanic communities in the United States and Mexico. He previously served as research director for the Gun Violence Prevention Team at the Center for American Progress, where he led policy analysis on U.S. gun laws and international firearms trafficking. He later completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention and conducting empirical research on firearm-related disparities, cross-border gun trafficking, violence, and violence trends in Latin America. His work includes studies on firearm mortality among his Hispanic populations, the flow of U.S.-sourced weapons into Mexico, and the impact of firearm threats on migrants. So with that introduction, I did want to make just one brief comment, and the slide there is, I guess, not in presentation mode. I don't think I'll be able to do that, Norma, huh?
I can change them for you, Dr. Hargarten.
Sure, if you could put it in presentation mode, that'd be great.
Okay.
For those of you who may recall, there was a Zika viral outbreak in Brazil in about 2014, 2015. And there was an obsession of what's going to be happening to those mosquitoes traveling from Brazil with carrying the Zika virus into the United States. And millions of dollars were set aside to address this growing epidemic, or the potential epidemic of the Zika virus. And it's so interesting during these times, and continue today, as you're going to hear, there's a flow of another vector, firearms, coming from the United States and going into Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And I think that's what I really wanted to show you on this slide, to just demonstrate that we've got a very big challenge of firearm violence in the Western Hemisphere. And the vector of this is largely coming, or at least significant portion of it coming from the United States, as we're going to hear. But first, let's have Dr. Vargas start us off with some of the ripple adverse effects of gun violence that she's been documenting with her research. There we go. And you can just keep pressing the advancement button there, Norma. Can you do that? It's kind of cool. There you go. The mosquito is traveling north. Keep pressing the advancement key as you just keep on going. And that was an obsession, really, in the United States of where this mosquito is going to invade the United States with the Zika virus. It's and adversely affecting newborns. And now we have this flow of firearms from the United States, and we're going to hear some specific locales from the states that are adversely affecting the communities that we're going to be talking about. So you just keep on pressing it, Norma, and then we'll there you go. So that's it for my opening remarks. I look forward to hearing from the three panelists. Dr. Vargas, please, let's have you start us off.
Okay, thanks. Norma, if you want to stop your share, I'll start mine. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Norma, are you able to stop your share? So, yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay, here we go. And I will put this on presentation mode. So everybody can see this on presentation mode, correct? Yes. Okay. So as thank you, Steve, for the great introduction. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Norma, for having us. And it's really an honor to be on this panel. So I'm going to talk about firearm-related violence, specifically about the consequences for healthcare services, so some of my prior research, and talk about the migration and mental health issue in my current research. So just as an overview, I'll just give a very brief introduction where I'll show you a very brief video. And I'll talk about the research with healthcare providers and on the impacts of violence there, and the impact on Latino immigrants and their mental health. And I just want you to try to pay attention to this common thread of trauma and mental health throughout the presentation. Okay, so Latin America is the most violent region in the world. I say it all the time, and I always start with this slide. 8% of the world's population live there, but a third of the worldwide homicides occur there. There are no war zones, there are no civil conflicts, and firearms are now the leading cause of death among children and youth, not just in the United States, but also in Brazil and in Mexico. This map was put together by our friends at Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, and I think John is joining us today. It shows guns recovered in Mexico and Central America that were traced back to the U.S. by zip code from 2015 to 2022.
Laura,
so
Laura, can
yeah.
I interrupt you? Could you please put it in presentation mode? It's not, it
Oh,
wasn't
it's
in
not?
presentation
Oh,
mode.
no.
Yes,
That's
please.
good. Hold on.
Sorry.
My apologies. So you're seeing my notes, and that's
You're seeing
how I'm cheating. Can you see this now?
You're seeing the slide, but it's not on presentation mode.
That's weird. Okay, hold on. Hold on. Let's share this again. All kinds of glitches. I'm sorry. Vamos a ver. Oh. Okay.
So get a click up there in the upper left-hand corner there. I think there's a there we go. That's better. Yes.
Oh, my apologies. So
thank you.
As I was saying, the bigger the circle on this map, the more firearms come specifically from that zip code. And the largest exporters, if you will, of these firearms are Texas and Arizona and some California. So, okay, I'll move on. So I just want to show you this brief video rather than tell you how violence affects, everyday life. And I'll just, say a couple words here and there throughout the video. So you'll hear gunshots going on outside the school. No nos pasa nada, corazón. Nada más pongan su carita en el piso. And the teacher's telling the kids to keep their head down. Pongan su carita en el piso. No. And you hear the gunshots.
Nada más vamos a hacer la cabeza, por favor. Vamos a cantar.
So the kids are scared. The teacher's like, do you want to sing a song?
¿Cuál? Sí, las gotas.
And it's a song about raindrops of chocolate falling out of the sky.
Me encantaría estar ahí. ¿Quién quiere chocolate? Yo. Abriendo la boca.
And she asks them to lay down face up so that they can better catch the raindrops in their mouth. But it's also to keep them on the ground so that they don't get up. All right. Okay, so that was just sort of a way of showing you some of the specific impacts that happen in the community, and how folks are affected. So in my research with providers in Mexico, I conducted 80 interviews, 80 interviews in 15 counties that were located in 5 states. And we asked people about what it's like to be in those places that are very high violence. And we found that there's impacts on the healthcare facilities and services, that there's impacts on providers themselves, and that there's impacts on the community. So this is a paper that we published from that. Now, just briefly, on the left, you see a map of the states that are in red are the states where I conducted all of these interviews: Baja California, Chihuahua, Guerrero, Michoacán, and Tamaulipas. And on the right, you see the homicide rate per county. So the darker the county, the higher the homicide rate. So I went to places in the red arrows, I went to places that tended to have very high homicide rates. Okay, so some of the examples of the impacts on services, they talked about limiting hours, right? So this person on top said that they killed the remaining 2 policemen that were in the town, and they asked for protection from, the state authorities. And they said, well, they didn't get a response. So the boss said, let's go. And so the person I spoke with left. And the next day, people came and they didn't find the doctors there, and they needed services. There's also prolonged absenteeism, and healthcare centers are understaffed. So this person in Chihuahua, nurse in Chihuahua, told us about the center being closed for 3 weeks and being limited in the number of doctors. They're supposed to have 3, they only have 1. On healthcare patients, this doctor told me about a chronic patient who stopped coming for checkups and later showed up with very high blood pressure. She said she had to leave because her name was on a list that was put in a mantle, a big mantle, placed in the public square with threats. If X people don't leave, we're going to kill you. And in terms of the mental health, they see a lot of mental health impacts in the populations that they serve, a lot of anxiety, insomnia, and a sense of insecurity. And in many places, there's not a psychologist for, in this case, 50 kilometers away. And in terms of impacts on provider, the biggest one is obviously fear, right? This person talked about being stopped by narcos in the past on the road, and he's over time becoming a little bit more paranoid, if you will. And he's talking about being killed 18 days before finishing his service at that particular clinic. So he was very afraid. And, another person talked about these experiences of having narcos come into the hospital and finishing people off inside the hospital. And if you oppose them, obviously you're going to be hurt. So in terms of the gun violence and migration, I wanted to just setting the stage both in the school, in education and in healthcare services. This doesn't just translate to Mexico, it happens all over the hemisphere. And so the environment is shaped by violence, specifically through this rampant criminal activity, these territorial disputes, the corruption and the complicity of local law enforcement and officers, and the impunity in judicial systems. So specifically, how does that show up in the health, say, of children? So pregnant mothers can have their babies exposed in utero. They're exposed, the trauma is affecting newborn babies and toddlers during really critical periods of development. And vaccines and immunizations, for example, don't become available because they control entrance to some areas. And if they can't enter the vaccination people, they can't vaccinate people. Finding a safe and affordable childcare is really problematic. And finding safe spaces for schooling is very problematic. Teenage boys get recruited to the gangs, and teenage girls are sexually exploited by the gangs. So all of this just has a very negative social and economic impact that there's a feeling that there's a lack of future for the children and the families. And so this can lead to migration. So in our study, we recruited 321 people at a respite center on the US-Mexico border. They were all adults, 18 years and older, who arrived to the United States within 14 days of our interview. 45% of the sample cited forced migration or displacement. Most were seeking asylum, and they came from every profession in life, lawyers, teachers, etc. And yes, you'd expect Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador to have a lot of, for a large portion of our sample to be from those countries, and Venezuela. But then you have places like Colombia, Peru, Cuba. So, it's a very diverse sample that's experiencing this violence all over the place. So I'll just point out some of the demographics. Our average age was 32 years old. The average years of schooling was almost 10. 67% of our sample was female. About a third lived with a significant other. And within our female sample, 22% were pregnant. Spanish was the language that was spoken at home the most. These are some examples of the firearm-related threats that people go through. In black, you see threats that are more about that are facilitated with firearms, and red, in the red writing, you'll see firearm-related threats or harms themselves. So 73% of our sample was extorted or robbed, 54% have witnessed an armed conflict, 52% have been exposed to frequent gunfire, and in a collaboration with Eugenio, we discovered that 48 of our sample had been exposed to being threatened with a firearm themselves. And of course, as I said, firearms facilitate other harms, and sexual humiliation and rape is a big one in this sample. Some of the migration, they told us about their migration. So 77% were apprehended at the border. 86%, this was their first time crossing into the United States. About 78% were traveling with children. So pregnant women, children, a big part of the sample. 67, almost 68% said that they had a mental health crisis along the way at some point. And 57% said that they had trouble providing food for their children, which was a big source of shame for the parents. I showed you the nationalities, predominantly Central American, but a lot from South America and some from the Caribbean as well. So just briefly, talking about these mental health phenotypes that we've developed. Our question was, how do we identify and prioritize the care for individuals who have the greatest risk for mental illness? And so we use a computer-adapted testing measure of mental health, specifically depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And this is based on symptom severity on a scale from 0 to 100 for all three disorders. And so in the darkest blue is the people with the worst mental health outcomes or symptom severity. The left column is our full sample. So on a score of 0 to 100, the average score was 49.6 for depression, 48.9 for anxiety, and 32 for PTSD. And so the reason why I'm showing you this is because I want you to pay attention to these distributions. So 65 plus 32 is 97. That's almost a third of the sample who have either severe or moderate health symptoms of these disorders. So the people in this group are probably definitely meeting criteria for all of these disorders. But you still have a third of the sample who are experiencing normal ranges to mild ranges of severity. So that's an important thing to focus on. There's a lot of resilience, but then there's a lot of harm. And of course, a lot of this has to do with accumulation of traumas, ACEs, other types of traumas in adulthood. So I just have a couple concluding thoughts. Gun-related violence is pervasive throughout the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And there's a public health message that there are upstream factors contributing to this firearm violence, to the illicit drug market, and to migration. So the more guns are trafficked from the United States, the higher the death and public health harms in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in the United States from the illegal drugs and guns that cause harm here. Higher traffic guns from the United States lead to weakened government institutions and democracy, and they lead to less social services and economic opportunity. More traffic guns lead to migration and internal displacement, And there are clinical implications specifically for Latinos arriving to this country. A, screening for trauma is essential, but it's not sufficient. Screening for symptoms severity of all three disorders is critical. But if a lot of providers, if providers are limited on time, from the chart I just showed you, it's likely that if screening for moderate to severe anxiety will find or will identify co-occurring depression and PTSD. And I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'll stop my share.
Thanks so much, Dr. Vargas. Such essential research and such a great example of how important this research is in illuminating the ripple effects, the adverse ripple effects of gun violence. Matt Schroeder, please.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to conference organizers for having me. It's a tough act to follow Laura here, but I'm going to do my best. The material is admittedly a bit more dry, a bit more technical, but hopefully it's still useful. I'm going to start my share. So I'm going to focus on the presentation mode. Okay, there we go. There we go. So I'm going to focus on the hardware. I'm going to look at the weapons and the mechanics of trafficking. And I'm going to focus on the Caribbean. And I just want to, I'll just say that the findings, the data in my presentation come from our latest report, which is out now, which Steve just mentioned. And I want to give a quick word of thanks to our partners, and their logos are here. I don't know if any are with us today, but they were wonderful. They contributed in ways that are kind of immeasurable to the report, and so I thought it was appropriate to mention them here. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try to be quick. I'm talking about the types and categories of illicit firearms in the Caribbean. And in the report, we look at AR and AK pattern rifles, large capacity magazines, and privately made firearms. For various reasons, they are in AK pattern rifles and large capacity magazines because those weapons, the proliferation of those weapons, give unauthorized end users increased capacity to commit harm in some ways, according to some criteria. And so the proliferation is certainly worth monitoring. And then I'm going to turn to the mechanics of trafficking. And this is something that we've followed for many years now. And so the report is kind of an update on that. So we're looking at trends. But if anything is unclear, and there's elements of this that I'm not going to get to because it wasn't a focus of the report. So including like smuggling techniques, concealment methods. I'm happy to talk about that afterwards in the Q&A session if desired. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about non-US trafficking, and this is as much about data as it is about the trafficking itself, just to highlight some of the data gaps that we have, continue to have. So I'm going to start with the types and quantities of illicit firearms. And before I discuss that specifically, I just want to say that one of the big contributions, or hopefully one of the big contributions of this particular chapter in our report, is it's not so much groundbreaking thematically, but we were able to acquire quantity and diversity of data that is unusual. And as a result, we were able to explore some of these issues in more depth, but also corroborate or challenge much more corroboration of common assumptions about trafficking. And that's important because in a field like this, where it's relatively small, there's, compared to other fields of study, there are a lot of assumptions, and oftentimes those assumptions proliferate and persist even when there isn't data behind them. So part of our job is to collect the data necessary to really test them to see if they're accurate. So that is in part one of the goals of our work here. And so the data we acquired very quickly, we acquired port seizure or data at about seizures at U.S. ports of Caribbean-bound firearms. We got that from Customs and Border Protection via FOIA. We also requested similar data from the Caribbean states, and this is new. I don't know of this data being out there before, so it would be seizures at Caribbean ports of incoming shipments. So to look at it from kind of the mirror end of the data from the US perspective. We also have trace data aggregated and a bit more disaggregated. So data on firearms that were submitted for tracing to US government and the results of that. Data on seizures as part of Operation Calypso, which was a multinational law enforcement effort that resulted in the seizure of about 100 firearms. So we got very detailed data on the types of firearms, where they were coming from, how they were being transported. Data on trace requests submitted through Interpol. So that's important because a lot of the trace data that we have is very US focused. It's to their credit, the US government has provided the most detailed data on tracing information in the region, but that's kind of one-sided. So we wanted to see something that might be a bit more broader in focus, and Interpol obliged. And then finally, we looked through documentation associated with 41 cases of prosecutions of traffickers that were sending weapons illegally to the Caribbean. And if anybody who's worked with court documents knows, it is very detailed. It's almost a blow-by-blow of the trafficking itself. So it's very rich information. And then finally, we had data on domestic seizures from several Caribbean countries. So a very broad, very voluminous and very detailed set of data to kind of test some of this and really see where we're at in terms of the types of weapons being trafficked and how they're trafficked. So here's types and quantities of illicit firearms from some of the data sets. And as you can see, handguns predominate, and this has been the case for years. Very little change in that regard. Seizure rates range from about 81 to upwards of more than 90% being handguns, most of which are pistols. Rifles comprised a much smaller percentage of the seized weapons, and this was true across data sets. And that's notable because that's very different from other parts of arms trafficking from the US to other countries, including Canada and Mexico. We're not seeing the trafficking of rifles into the Caribbean to the same extent as to other countries in the hemisphere. And then finally, submachine guns and machine guns. We're not seeing the military types machine guns. And that's not surprising given that the most readily available weapons are not weapons stolen from military depots in the United States. It's weapons that one can walk into a gun store and buy as a civilian. So there are issues with that data, but I'll just leave that there. Submachine guns, machine guns, true submachine guns, machine guns, very small percentage, unlike some other places, other war zones where they're much more frequent. And then here's the data from a couple other data sets. As you can see, same thing. Seizures at US ports, 79% handguns, trace requests, 87%, et cetera. Rifles, a little higher percentage in the US data on US source firearms, and I suspect that's because that's where unauthorized end users are getting their rifles. They're getting them from the United States, and so that's reflected in the data. We look specifically at AR and AK pattern rifles for a couple of reasons. First of all, AR and AK pattern rifles, as Genio can speak to, are a favorite of the cartels in Mexico. And so we were concerned that the trafficking, that type of trafficking, that desire, that demand for those rifles could start to shift in the Caribbean with some of the drug trafficking organizations there. And what we're seeing, the data on this is much more limited because very few of the data sets that we have break down by model, but they do in the seizures of port seizure data from the United States. And what that reveals is that there's been a significant jump percentage-wise in seizures of AR and AK pattern rifles from Caribbean-bound shipments, which comprised just 1% 2017 to 2020, up to 11% in 2021, 2024. However, that the trafficking appears to be very concentrated in shipments to just a few countries and just a few shipments compared to the total number. And so 13, all of the ARs and AKs that we identified were in 13 shipments out of 230 to just 6 countries, and 65% were recovered in 2 seizures to the Dominican Republic and Guyana. And what this hints at is a gradual bifurcation in the trafficking of firearms to the Caribbean. you have a subset of countries, a small subset of countries, that is receiving higher percentages of certain weapons that are much less prevalent in other parts of the Caribbean. And AR and AK pattern rifles are one of them. Same with high capacity magazines. So this data we've been collecting for a while, and I first saw it, I was kind of blown away by this. Of the magazines identified by capacity, because not all of them are in the data, 88% were considered large capacity, according to the US government definition, in 2017 to 2020. And that number shot up to 91% in 2021 to 2024. So that's not what I thought of when I thought about trafficking in the Caribbean. I tend to think about pistol, just standard pistol magazines. And I will note that in the first category of large capacity magazines, 11 to 29, that includes some standard capacity sizes for pistols, so 11 to 20. But the numbers of large capacity magazines that hold 30 or more, so we're talking about the banana clips for the AK pattern rifles, or the drums that hold 50, 100, sometimes 200 rounds of ammunition, very significant percentage of the seized magazines that are identified by capacity, alarming. But again, it's very limited in terms of the target countries, the destination countries. Shipments to Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Trinidad and Tobago accounted for 86% of the magazines capable of holding 30 or more rounds. And then 94% of the magazines capable of holding 50 rounds. So the drum magazines were headed for just 2 countries. And I suspect that the shipments to the Dominican Republic, at least some of those are going to Haiti. Haiti is a magnet for a lot of these weapons at the moment, which should come as no surprise to anybody. We also looked at privately made firearms, in part because this is an institutional-wide focused, because of the potential paradigmatic shift that could occur if this technology, if this sourcing of weapons were to catch on. And what I mean by that is, right now, currently, the vast majority of firearms that we see that have been seized from criminals are factory produced. It's just the weapons that that have always been acquired by criminals. So it's guns that are made in large manufacturing plants and then purchased at stores. So the whole kind of control ecosystem is set up around preventing illicit acquisition of guns from that source through that supply chain. However, starting in 2013, with the introduction of what's referred to a 3D printed firearm called the Liberator, there were fears that this would start to change. And those fears have been accelerated by the development, the very deliberate development of increasingly sophisticated, increasingly reliable, and increasingly varied firearms made from 3D printed components and other kind of commercial off-the-shelf components. And the concern here is that eventually we're going to reach a tipping point where criminals will find that the affordability, the accessibility, and the quality of what we refer to as privately made firearms, PMFs, are equal to, or in some cases better than, factory produced firearms. And then all bets are off. Then we're in real trouble, because then the production and the distribution will be so centralized, and the control points will be so few that it will be game changing. We are not there yet, but we are very cognizant of the possibility, and therefore in all the areas we look for this. And in the Caribbean, again, it's primarily factory produced weapons from what we can tell, but there are some alarming either instances or trends that we're trying to highlight, including in the port seizures. There's been a notable increase in seizures of receivers, so rifle receivers, pistol frames, and receiver kits. These are the components for a type of privately made firearm that are often referred to as 80% firearms, or firearms made from 80% receivers. These are partially finished receivers. That's kind of the chassis of the gun that is then completed with some machining, very basic machining, and components, which are less rigorously controlled. So a very significant increase in seizures of those units, from 48 units in the earlier part of the time frame we looked at to 167 units. And the photo in the upper right-hand side is an example, a more anecdotal example from Trinidad and Tobago. This is a seizure of 91 rifle receivers. Nobody has 91 rifle receivers unless they're making privately made firearms. That would be the only reason. So this was seized from an end user or a seller that intended to convert all of these items into fully functional firearms. And then also in the port seizure itself, we identified a shipment of 14 homemade, meaning unserialized, receivers found in 2 shipments to Haiti in 2020, which, given the chaos in Haiti, the difficulty of controlling arms in Haiti, that just compounds and makes it even more difficult. And then the final one I want to point out is the photo in the lower right-hand corner. That is an FGC-9. This is a type of 3D printed firearm that was developed specifically to circumvent gun controls. There's an entire online community that's global that is developing new designs of 3D printed firearms all the time, and their specific kind of MO is to circumvent gun controls, and that's reflected in the name. FGC stands for F, gun control, and so there have been several iterations of this, each of which eliminates another component that's controlled. So I think the second version of this, the mod 2, they were boasting that none of the components were actual firearms components. They were components that were uncontrolled, get at a hardware store, print yourself. So very alarming trends. Seen some of that in the Caribbean, but it has not met critical mass yet, and hopefully it won't. The other item I want to mention that is a huge problem in the United States right now, they're called machine gun conversion devices. These are simple, easy to use devices you plug into the back of a pistol, and it becomes, for all intents and purposes, a machine gun. One pull of the trigger, you can empty the magazine. These are everywhere in the United States right now. They're just a scourge. And so we're expecting to see these start to show up in the seized shipments. We didn't. And the reason we spoke with law enforcement about this is because these items are so cheap and so easy to acquire elsewhere that they don't rely on the U.S. or U.S. sellers for them like they do for the firearms components. The official mentioned China specifically, but I don't know if it's limited to China. But these are a big problem because especially when you take a pistol or a rifle and you pair them with a large capacity magazine, say a 100-round drum, and then you fit a conversion device, that is a submachine gun or a machine gun. And that's a big problem. So those are privately made firearms. We also, so now I'll just turn to trafficking dynamics a bit. So a lot of the kind of conventional thinking is that a lot of the trafficking from the United States is from Florida. And there are anecdotal examples in the press, often claimed by U.S. officials, but we had very little data to really test that. But recently we acquired the port version of the port seizure data that includes the area of seizure, and it's by CBP field office. And lo and behold, all of that conventional thinking is correct. Of the shipments that were seized from 2017 to 2024, 75% were seized in 5 ports in Florida. So that's pretty definitive, I think. And then if you add in Atlanta and Tampa, it's almost 80%. So we also, thanks to the wide variety of data, we also wanted to check some of that to make sure it wasn't just an anomaly of the U.S. data, and it's really not. So when we looked at the U.S. court cases, of those in which the transport locations were identified, 25 to 29 cases Florida and Georgia. Data on seizures at ports in Belize. According to Belizean authorities, all 17 of the seizures that they have documented at Belizean ports, the last port, which the vessel came from, was Miami. More corroboration. And then, but it's not just the transport, it's also procurement. So where are the guns being purchased? They're also being purchased in Florida and to a lesser extent, Georgia. And the data on that is pretty remarkable. So 70% of the successful traces of firearms seized in the Caribbean were traced back to sellers in Florida and Georgia. And if you break down that data by county, about, I think it was 44% of that 70%, two counties in Florida, which means 30% of all successfully traced firearms in this time period that were seized in the Caribbean came from gun sellers in 2 counties in Florida. Then finally, Operation Calypso, 79% of the interdicted international shipments departed from the U.S. But what was interesting about that was that most of those seizures were from New York rather than Florida. There were still Florida seizures from Florida, but there were also several from New York. And that kind of fits with some of the examples of seizures in recent seizures in the Caribbean, in which you had weapons that were hidden in consumer goods in shipments from New York. And that, I think so it's tempting to say, okay, well, if we can just concentrate law enforcement resources on those 2 counties in Florida and then the ports in southern Florida, we can solve this problem. It's not like any problem like this, it's not that simple. There's trafficking from other areas. And then if you were to exert pressure on those areas in Florida, my suspicion, but didn't do anything else, my suspicion is that trafficking would just migrate to other areas because the barriers to doing so are pretty low. So this has to be, and counter-trafficking efforts have to be nationwide. And it'd be good to focus on Florida to the extent that you can, but it cannot be the sole focus of counter-trafficking efforts. And finally, we also looked at modes of transport. And again, the popular assumption is that most of these weapons are packed into shipments into maritime shipping agencies that have a regional focus or even a country focus, and they're shipping small quantities to the country that way. So when we got the data on modes of transport from the port seizures, we were kind of shocked to see that it was pretty evenly divided between commercial vessels, so the maritime shipments from local freight forwarders and shippers, and commercial air. And so we approached U.S. government officials about this, and they said, well, I think what's probably going on is that commercial air shipments are screened more thoroughly. There are fewer of them, and because of air safety standards and requirements, they're screened more thoroughly. So this probably reflects just a greater percentage of seizures from that particular mode. And they said really most of the trafficking is through maritime shipments, which really is not good news, because to fully search containers in a cargo ship, just a single container, sometimes it can take 3 hours. And so the logistical barriers to screening all maritime cargo are just kind of overwhelming. So that's another observation in the report. And then finally, looking at source code other than the United States, this was one of our goals. We had, pretty good data on U.S. source weapons. We've had it for a while. We wanted to get data to see where else firearms are coming from, because it can't all be coming from the United States, and they're not. And the Interpol data confirms this is the successful traces of firearms submitted through Interpol. However, even in cases where we're looking at non-U.S. sources, the U.S. still comes up. So 53% of the successful traces through Interpol trace back to North America. They wanted us to aggregate by region, not country, and that's why it's displayed that way. And that's notable because countries in the region, or law enforcement in the region, they're probably going to go straight to ATF if they suspect it's a U.S. weapon. So even in cases where they don't suspect it's a U.S. weapon, the U.S. still shows up in a big way. However, it does confirm that South America, Central America, and the Caribbean are also sources of proximate sources of illicit firearms in the region. So it's not just a U.S. problem, but it is primarily a U.S. problem. And then this is just
Pat, I think we're going to have to tie this up now to give Eugenio a little bit of a chance. So please summarize this and we'll move on. Thank you.
So I'll just conclude with that. This is more data that kind of says the same thing. So thank you very much, and apologies for running over.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Eugenio, please.
Thank you. Am I allowed to share my screen, please? Okay. I don't know where I can share my screen here. Sorry, guys, I'm not able to share my screen for some reason. I don't see that button.
Okay, let me, Eugenio, is it okay if I do it? Okay.
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Norma. I appreciate it.
No problem. Share. Okay.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eugenio Weigand Vargas. I'm going to present on a study that I conducted at the University of Michigan on state-level bans on assault weapons in the United States and firearms trafficking to Mexico. Can you go to the next slide and the next? There's no disclosures, and this was supported by NIH. So just a little bit of context. In the United States, the production of firearms rose significantly during 2005, and particularly driven by rifles and high caliber pistols. And this increase coincided with the expiration of the United States ban on assault weapons that was in place from 1994 to 2004. And as you can see here on the chart, this is firearm homicide rates in the regions of Central America and the Caribbean. And in the gray chart are non-firearm homicides, and in the black one are firearm homicides. As you can see, the rates are going kind of the same pace, parallel to each other. And then in 2005, there's a significant shift in firearm related homicide rates, again, in the region of Central America and the Caribbean. However, rates of non-firearm homicide maintain a steady level. And studies have shown that coincides with that increase in the production of firearms in the United States, particularly that of rifles and high caliber pistols. Can you go to the next slide, please? Particularly in the case of Mexico, studies have shown, reports from the ATF have constantly been indicating that between 65 to 75% of firearms recovered in Mexico are traced back to the United States. And again, this has been consistent across the years. Other reports suggest that 50% of those firearms that are intended to be trafficked to Mexico are assault rifles, particularly AK and 47 and AR-15 style rifles. And in this regard, there's at least two studies that have shown that when the United States removed its ban on assault weapons, or the ban expired in 2004, homicides increased in Mexico. Firearm homicides increased in Mexico, particularly in border states. In fact, one study showed that the municipalities that border Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico saw a significant increase in firearm homicides, but not those that were bordering California. And the reason they argue is that California maintained its own ban on assault weapons. However, there has been limited data on firearm traffic dynamics, on the type of guns that are trafficked to Mexico, where they are located. There has been historically limited data. However, can you go to the next slide? So our objectives was to examine and describe firearms recovered in Mexico and traced back to the United States by state of origin, by type, by calibers, and very importantly, by time to crime. Why is this important? Because when a firearm is purchased and recovered in a crime within a year, for example, it's definitely a sign that that weapon was sold with the intent to be trafficked. So we divided our analysis between 3 different types of time to crime: 3 years or more, 1 to 3 years, which is already a sign of trafficking, and then 1 year or less, which is definitely an indicator that that firearm was purchased with the intent to be trafficked. And then we explored the association between whether a U.S. state banned assault weapons and the volume of firearms recovered in Mexico that were traced to each state. Again, this association across the different categories of time to crime. Now, to do that, can you go to the next slide, please? The next and the next. I know John is here, and I want to, one before. Big shout out to John and his work at Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, because they obtained information via FOIA request of firearms recovered in a crime in Mexico that were traced to an FFL in the U.S. between 2015 and July 2024. So with that, we were able to look at the state of origin, types, calibers, and then time to crime. We did, next slide, please. We then did a negative binomial analysis where we simply looked at if a state banned assault weapons or had some form of ban, was the volume of firearms being trafficked to Mexico reduced if that state had that ban in place? And we obviously control for other covariates, such as, if the state had background checks during private sales, if the state was a border state, so Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, the volume of exports to Mexico in hundreds of dollars, and the percentage of each state's population that were reported to be firearm owners. Next slide, please. And next slide. So there was one before. Thank you. So we had 67,300 firearms that were examined. This table is divided by time to crime. So the first column is less than 1 year. The second column is between 1 and 3 years. And the third column is more than 3 years, meaning when they purchased the gun and when it was recovered in Mexico, more than 3 years passed. So overall, what we see here is that when we look at long time to crime firearms, the types of guns are more likely pistols. But when we look at the shorter time to crime, the rifles are represent more than 50% of those weapons, meaning those guns that were purchased with the intent or are believed so to be purchased with the intent to be trafficked tend to be rifles. And then what we see here is that also we tend to see higher calibers. So for example, the 7.62 millimeters, while only 10% of those firearms that were recovered with a long time to crime, they represented close to 11%. When we look at the much shorter time to crime, they represent 30%. So what this is telling us is those guns that are being sold with intent to be trafficked to Mexico tend to be rifles and of higher caliber as well. Overall, just the overall the 67,300 firearms, around 33% were rifles and 55% were pistols overall. Still, even when you compare it to the US, the proportion of rifles that are trafficked to Mexico is much, much higher than the proportion of rifles recovered in crimes in the United States. Can you go to the next slide, please? In terms of geography, I think this map reflects perfectly what Laura showed in terms of like where guns are being purchased. Texas, Arizona, and California, and somewhat Florida and New Mexico are the source of many of the crimes found in Mexico. However, next slide, please. The key to this analysis is I think the time to crime as well. And I'll give you the example of California. So California, and the time to crime of more than 3 years, it proportionally is 60%. So 60% of those crime guns recovered in Mexico that had 3 years or more of time to crime came from California. But when we look at those short time to crime, less than 2% come from California. And this fits with our hypothesis that the guns that are being trafficked to Mexico tend to be rifles of high caliber or assault weapons. And that's why, because California has its own ban on assault weapons, this proportion drops in the shorter time to crime. Another thing that is worth highlighting here is that in addition to border states, you do see states like Florida, Nevada, Oklahoma, even Colorado, being important suppliers of crime guns to Mexico across all time to crime categories. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then within our model, basically what this tells us right here is that if a state bans assault weapons, it is 76% less likely to send guns to Mexico than states that do not ban assault weapons. And this is even higher when we look at short time to crime as well. So if a state bans assault weapons, they are less likely to send firearms to Mexico with a long time to crime firearms, more than 3 years, but even less likely to send firearms with a short time to crime. We also see, as expected, that border states were significant, meaning, yes, border states tend to supply more firearms to Mexico than other states. And if a state, the higher the level of gun ownership in a state, the higher it is likely that they all send firearms to Mexico this was only significant in the long time to crime firearms, however. Next slide, please. Next. So we looked at, again, just to sum up, we looked at 67,000, before. We looked at 67,300 firearms that were recovered in Mexico and traced to the US. Border states, as expected, dominate the trafficking routes. However, we did see that exception with California when we only looked at short time to crimes. California decreased significantly its proportion of guns being sent to Mexico. And we hypothesize that is due to its own ban on assault weapons. We do see that rifles, particularly those calibers linked to AK-47s and AR-15s, being linked to shorter time to crime and trafficking flows. Pistols were much more common in the long time to crime recoveries. Next slide, please. I already mentioned this, but I think it's important. So 55% of guns recovered in Mexico were pistols, 37 were rifles. But still, the proportion of rifles recovered in Mexico, it's much, much higher than those in the United States, where most of the crimes are perpetrated with handguns. And I say this because sometimes when policies are being discussed in the United States, they focus a lot on the handguns because it's the most common weapon recovered in a crime. And I think this analysis is important because it highlights the need to expand our area of focus and say, yes, it's true that most of the guns in the United States recovered in crime are handguns. But if you open and broaden the scope, you see that rifles have a huge impact beyond the United States border. And that's why I think it's very important to highlight that. Can you go to the next slide, please? There are some policy implications that I think are important and derived from our analysis. One is clearly that state bans matter. Whether a state regulates assault weapons or ban assault weapons matters, not just only in the flow of firearms within the United States, but externally to other countries as well. Potentially, states can regulate their assault weapons or potentially limit the bulk of assault weapons purchased or impose waiting periods as well. In terms of federally, what some of the policy implications federally for the United States can be, of course, consider regulating assault weapons, but also consider them regulating under the National Firearms Act. So right now, those firearms that are regulated under the NFA are seldomly recovered in crimes in the United States. In fact, the 67,300 firearms that we analyzed in this data set, only 0.3% of those guns would have fallen under the National Firearms Act. So that's another recommendation that I think is important. And I think one that is super relevant, and we've seen across all the presentations, is the better data. I know that John and Stop US Arms had to go through a whole process of FOIA requests to get this data. But once this data is out there, one potential recommendation is to do this on an annual basis, have ATF report these types of data sets on an annual basis. That way we can identify if trends have changed, or we could potentially evaluate other policies related to firearms. On the next slide, please.
We're gonna just have to wrap it up there.
Yep. I'm gonna skip the limitations. You can go to the conclusions. Okay, yep. There we go. U.S. firearm policies do have a significant effect across borders, federally and at a state level. And this is very important because these are issues that are intersecting with issues that are of importance to the United States, like organized crime, drug trafficking, and as Laura mentioned earlier in her presentation, migration flows as well. So policymakers in the United States should consider both domestic and regional impacts when crafting firearm legislation. And I'll wrap it up with that.
Thank you so much, and apologies. I must apologize for having us run over. I know I was contributing to the delayed start, but lots to talk about. Great presentations from our three presenters, and unfortunately, we're going to be not having enough time for questions directly to the panelists, but perhaps in the chat. We're going to move right into the next webinar to allow that to unfold with Keith Martin being the moderator. And I apologize for this again for the delayed start on my part. So I think that's really how we're going to wrap it up. Again, great presentations, and you have their emails. Norma, perhaps people on the participants would want to send emails to our presenters to follow up with any questions that they may have.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this important session, and immense gratitude to our previous speakers, Dr. Laura Vargas, Matt Schroeder, and Eugenio Weigand. I hope all of you really got a very good sense of the scope of the problem, and you also got a sense of some solutions. And that is this part of the session. So what we're going to do is for the next hour, we're going to feed off the wonderful presentations in the first half, and we're going to go and with the wonderful speakers that we have, delve into, well, what do we do about it now? So I'm Keith Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. I'm going to share a few slides that we have. Let's hope I don't mess this up. Great. And then we're going to, I think that's, do you see it in presentation mode? We're all good?
All good.
Good. Thank you very much, Norma. And the speakers that we have today, the order of run of show, so to speak, will be Elizabeth Burke. Elizabeth Burke is the Chief Operating Officer for the Global Action on Gun Violence. Next up will be Professor Elizabeth Ward. Professor Ward is a physician and epidemiologist. She's the chair and co-founder of Violence Prevention Alliance. She's a professor in the University of the West Indies, and she was, interestingly enough, the director of disease prevention and control at what was then the Ministry of Health in Jamaica. And then on our third and final spot, we'll have Dean Peacock. Dean is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He is on the Lancet Commission on Global Gun Violence and Health. He has more than 3 decades of experience in violence prevention, conflict prevention, and equity. A few words to start off with. Isn't it remarkable that we're seeing a quarter of the U.S. Navy situated right now in the Caribbean, ostensibly to reduce drug trafficking? But I think all of you heard very clearly from the wonderful presentations that what we're going to talk about today, the uncontrolled, the huge export, the Iron River of weapons into Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean, is driving a lot of the massive problems that are taking place south in the Americas, including in North America, including violence and an array of other challenges that are destabilizing countries and communities and causing an extraordinary loss of life. So what I'm going to do is just go through a few slides before I hand it off to Elizabeth and see if that works. Let's see. Norma, can you advance that? I'm just having a little trouble. It's not advancing it.
I can't unless you stop sharing your screen, Keith.
Oh, I'm going to just see if I can. Nope. See, I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah. Oh, give me 1 second.
Thank you. Anyway, in the meantime, I just have a few slides. The status quo that we have right now is a political choice. which means it can be politically undone. What I want to do is just in the initial comments for this presentation is really try to motivate all of you who are on this session and those who you know to support the solutions that you've seen here, and also the groups and organizations that you've seen on this particular session. Let's see, I can't seem to sharing my screen. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing, Norma. If you put that out, please, that would be great. Great. Okay. If you could share those slides, Norma, that would be great, please. And so it's a political choice what we have today, and the egress of small arms into Latin America is not only causing, as we've seen, massive loss of life, criminality, destabilization of governments, destabilizing of communities. It is a major security threat, and it is driving migration north. This country has been demonizing migrants. They've been demonizing those who are leaving, but they're leaving because they're trying to save their lives for the most part. So it's really grossly unfair and, quite frankly, bullying to start labeling these poor folks who are leaving because they are often fleeing for their life, and the violence, including the sexual violence that many women have been subjected to as a result, in part, of this flow of weapons from the United States into Latin America and the Caribbean. So there are solutions that can be done to address them. These are political choices. There are, in fact, a lot of legislation right now on the in Congress that can be passed. And in order to do that, finally, we need to make this a political issue. In my view, it needs to be an electoral issue. You support these issues, we could vote for you. If you don't support them, we're going to vote against you. As a former politician, let me just say that that's how it works. You make these things cold, hard political issues, and people will jump one way or the other. So, in my view, that is a way to be able to move the ball forward and start implementing solutions that should have been implemented a long time ago. And with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Elizabeth Burke, and I hope at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers. And for any of the speakers that were on in the first half, I'm going to give each of you a minute, if you're still on, to be able to have any closing comments. So with that, Elizabeth Burke, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Keith. My name's Elizabeth Burke. I'm Chief Operating Officer of Global Action. We're very happy to be here. I'll share my screen or attempt to. So as we've already begun talking about, this is definitely a global issue, and we are spreading our epidemic of gun violence to the rest of the world. And I want to talk just a little bit about how we can use litigation as a tool to reduce gun violence. There's no single solution to this problem, but litigation does allow us to do a few things that other strategies do not. It enables us, excuse me, to reform the suppliers and manufacturers, the firearms themselves. Really, the driver of this epidemic is the firearms manufacturers and suppliers. And historically in the United States, litigation has played a pivotal role in U.S. public health concerns. When companies turn a blind eye to the consequences of their product design, we can turn to litigation when we can't turn to legislation, which is the issue that we have here. And litigation can help force change by forcing a shift of costs, really, and internalizing the harms to the manufacturers instead of externalizing the harms to the people. So this is a principle that's familiar across public health fields. Litigation helped to reframe the narrative around tobacco and contributed to major drops in smoking-related deaths. Lawsuits against drug companies altered the national conversation about opioids. And even when cases aren't immediately successful in court, they can help change the story, change the narrative. and that can push regulation through legislation. When it comes to gun violence, that's especially important to turn to the courts, because we know that we're not really going to be able to turn to the legislatures at this point. Not only because of Second Amendment and hesitancy on the part of legislation, even friendly legislators, but the industry has gotten codified some extraordinary protections for themselves, and therefore they've been able to stop the flow of data to public health reformers like everyone who's testified here today. The TR Amendment bans the release of firearms tracing data by the ATF, and that was passed in 2003. And the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act was passed in 2005. These two act together as an extraordinary protection for the gun industry. And we saw that after the SHIELD law went up, the TR law went up, there was a 203% increase in crime guns. Now, the gun industry knows how it supplies the criminal market. We should not make any mistake about that. They have been told repeatedly how to police themselves.
Sorry for interrupting you, Elizabeth. Could you put your screen into presentation mode, if that's possible?
Not sure.
You can't, don't worry. It's just might make it a little bit easier if that's possible. If not, don't worry.
Maybe hit slideshow.
Yeah, slideshow.
Correct. Yeah, and you can say from beginning. No, the presenter view
From current slide.
from current slide. Correct. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
And sorry,
Thank you.
I'm also fighting the flu, so I apologize for my voice. Okay, so the gun industry has been told how it supplies the criminal market, and this is important because when we bring a litigation, we want to be able to show that they know what is negligent and what isn't negligent. So they've been told by the DOJ and manufacturers conventions, they've been told that they should self-police their distribution chain. And in fact, at one point there was lawsuits against the gun manufacturers, and Smith and Wesson actually stepped up and agreed to an historic agreement that actually put a lot of these reforms into place. Had that agreement gone forward, had that settlement gone forward and not been derailed by the gun industry, it would be interesting to know where we would be. I think we would be in a much better position than we are now. But the NRA turned the entire industry against Smith & Wesson, and Smith & Wesson eventually backed away from that settlement. Just showing the power, I think, of the industry and that they know what they're doing when they are changing the way that they sell weapons and ignoring the way that they should sell weapons. So here are some of the things that Smith & Wesson had agreed to, and some of the things that we are attempting to get through some litigation. No assault weapons or large capacity magazines, no sales to indicted dealers or straw purchasers, change in the way that they market and design the guns, change in the way that they sell multiple guns at one time, or sell without completed background checks. So the industry can police their own distribution chain. This is extremely important. Before we mentioned, and many of the other presenters mentioned that about 5% of dealers sell about 90% of crime guns. And if the manufacturers would police the change of what dealers they allowed to sell their products, then we could really reduce a lot of the flow of the guns, and particularly a lot of flow of the guns that end up south of the border. They could refuse to supply to high-crime gun dealers. Could develop training programs to identify straw purchasers, which is actually a fairly easy thing to do. Straw purchasing is not rocket science. And if you do sort of do a lot of these things and we can put a gun dealer out of business, then we can show that there's been a huge decrease in the guns that are recovered in the area. So one of the ways that we've started to try and do this is through our litigation. Mexico bravely stepped up and filed the first lawsuit by a foreign nation against, well, there's two lawsuits. Smith & Wesson was a lawsuit against the manufacturers and alleging just what I've just said, that they negligently and illegally facilitate cross-border trafficking by deliberately selling their guns to the worst of the worst gun dealers. This lawsuit did an enormous amount of good in bringing this issue to the fore, was dismissed by the Supreme Court this summer. Luckily, the dismissal was quite narrow and won't really impact any other gun litigation going forward. The second lawsuit is against 5 dealers in the state of Arizona, and that lawsuit is continuing, and it's in progress, and it's moving into the discovery phase, which means that we'll be able to ask questions and get documents and sales practices from the dealers. So that's an exciting development. There's also a design case, and these two cases, I should say, are sales practice cases, right? So we're going after the sales practices of the gun industry. Another way to go after the gun industry is lawsuits on design. And so the Price versus Smith & Wesson arises from a mass shooting in Toronto, and that is moving forward as a class action. It was initially held that it could not be a class action, which was very harmful to it because Canada has a fee shifting burden, and only if the case goes forward as class action could the plaintiffs not be in danger of having cost of litigation assessed against them if they lost. So it's a big decision that they've allowed this case to go forward as a class action. Just note that kind of fee shifting from the defendants, everybody pays their own costs, to if you lose, you have to pay costs, is an important part. And Florida has a fee shifting provision like that, which makes it very difficult to bring cases in Florida, which is just another protection for the gun industry. And then we have another defective design case. In this case, it's actually going up to the Supreme Court. We've petitioned the Supreme Court to look at this case, and it will hold. We're asking it to hold that PLACA, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, is unconstitutional. And then we've also taken litigation outside the United States on behalf of the Olivers who lost their son in Parkland. We filed what we're calling the lawsuit for survival, and it's a case in the Inter-American Human Rights Commission that is assessing that the U.S. government is violating human rights law by failing to protect people from the right to live free from gunfire. And so this case is actually on a fast track. In human rights cases can take a very long time, but we've already had several great developments in this case. So our theory of change is that litigation can reform the gun industry, and that we can have pressure from outside the U.S. into the U.S. And global comparisons can show that not every country sells guns like this, and that the U.S. is willfully, negligently exporting our gun problem to the rest of the world. As people here have mentioned, U.S. guns are fueling the cartels, they're fueling drug problems and migration flows. So there is a global call for reform of the U.S. gun industry, and we're happy to be part of it. These are just a few, again, of most that I've talked about already, but just some of the lawsuits, some of the ways we're thinking about trying to reform the gun industry through litigation.
You're on mute, Keith. You're on mute.
Great. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, that was an outstanding presentation. Thank you very much for a really pointed overview of actions that have been taken and can be taken to reduce gun violence in the Americas. And with that, we'll move on to Professor Elizabeth Ward. Professor Ward, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Really pleased to be here, but let me just clarify. I'm a professor of practice. I've worked for about 20 years in the area of trying to prevent violence, and in particular had a very specific interest in gun violence. I don't have a presentation, so I will just raise some points, and must say I have really enjoyed all the previous presentations, and would love to see more of our public health doctors and surgeons, and even our people in litigation having access to this information. In 2000, we actually looked at all the hospital data and saw that the violence-related injuries was the highest cost to the hospital service. So we worked with CDC and WHO and actually set up what we call the Jamaica Injury Surveillance System. And what we do is ask 5 questions: who, where, why, what, and when. So when we look at the method, that's where we get the gunshot information. Gunshots actually would account for roughly between about 10% of all the injuries seen at the emergency department. This is because, as Steve and myself have discussed, the effectiveness of guns at killing people. So most of the patients who are victims do not reach the hospital. And Jamaica, as you know, in the past has had one of the highest rates of homicide in Latin America and the Caribbean, and has even reached famously to about 64 per 100,000. We have had a decrease over the last year, and we have seen a fall in that homicide rate to about 35. Well over 80% of all our homicides are with guns, and most of them are with pistols, handguns. And what we have seen is that our ports are major entries into the country of guns into the country. And as we heard earlier on, that most of the shipments come in a maritime way. Very few come through the airports. But of the gunshot wounds that come to the hospital, the burden is tremendous on the head staff and that. And we actually looked at the cost of it, and with using a WHO methodology, and we were able to show that we actually had in our money, which you can kind of divide it by 150, in 1 year, if we looked at the 25,000 cases of violence-related injuries that we saw, it would have cost us about 8.6 billion Jamaican dollars. And that money is, but also when we get in our hospitals a gunshot wounds, when we started out, 1 in 4 of our elective cases of surgery were being canceled. And that alone, and the money that was spread all over the front page of every major newspaper and every news feed, got a lot of work done and got money invested in prevention and tracking of cases and back into the communities. Because we found, which I think we found in other countries, that maybe up to about 25% of the cases of violence-related injuries that come to the hospital leave the hospital with the intention to carry out retribution. So they would say, I'm going home to get my gun to get the guy who had stabbed him. And so we see an escalation of these injuries. So gunshot wounds have always been the most destructive, and the guns used are imported. We don't manufacture any guns, and have worked over the years with Calypso and looked and worked with the Pathways program that is they just launched their report in Trinidad 2 days ago. What I think, you heard the hard numbers and the statistics and the types of guns, because Matt had done most of that work and tracing, that where the guns, what type of guns, how they get into the country, and that it's not only Jamaica now, but it's now many of the other islands. Trinidad is the hot seat as we speak now. Haiti has been so problematic for so many years. But Trinidad and some of the smaller islands where 1 or 2 deaths from a gunshot affects the whole country and sends their rates, because of their small population, their rates to the head of homicide charts all over the world. So that issue is really important. So us as practitioners know that we have to control the vector, and the vector in this case is pistols, and we are definitely able to do that if we have control over what comes through our ports. The issue of the majority of these handguns coming from Florida has been known over the last 20 years. And though I hear that if you clamp down on just one region of the US, it will shift to another, I think the fact that it has not shifted over the last 20 years is really maybe a point for discussion, because I think if we are agile, and I think we have enough technology now, as a location shift from Miami, Dade, and Broward, we can shift the screening for these guns. And also that we now know Georgia is part of that problem. So that's another point. But the burden on the country, the burden on the people, and the burden on innocent bystanders is really so severe, and that we should be able to try and do something more about controlling the inflows into the country, and controlling the sources of these guns as we go forward. So the last thing I'd say is that the good thing about the meeting in Trinidad is that everybody in the security business and in the health business and several countries got together and said, we have a problem. And they got together among agreeing to do things on data sharing and working better with multiple law enforcement agencies and with hospital data to help. And I think if we can build on that and get support across the whole region and internationally and in the US, we could make a serious dent and reduce the number of firearm deaths by more than 50% over the next 5 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Ward. And being in Jamaica, from Jamaica, you've seen it at a personal level. It's certainly your comments are taken to heart. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, which is a nice segue into for Dean Peacock, who is our next speaker. And just the point you made on the need to really mobilize medical associations, the private sector, folks in the insurance business, healthcare, private sector leaders to drive a political movement, because the status quo is costing the many for the benefit of the very, very few gun manufacturers. With that, I will turn it over to Dean. Dean, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith. And colleagues, it's really a privilege and an honor to be on a panel with you all. I think I've cited all of your work and, have really been moved and inspired by the comments and troubled, of course, by your comments today or this evening here in Cape Town. And I'm based in South Africa most of the time. I do also spend a fair amount of time in the US, in northeastern California, which is very much a gun area. Lots of people wearing National Rifle Association shirts and, of course, Trump shirts and hats as well. But today I was immersed in the world of gun violence prevention in South Africa. We're in the middle of pushing for an amendment to our Firearms Control Act. And so one of the government bodies today hosted a meeting bringing together mostly industry actors, but also civil society activists, advocates, and researchers. And what was interesting was the infusion of US-based language into the discussion, in the sense that our constitutional court in South Africa has been abundantly clear. It has ruled on the question of whether people have the right to own a gun. And it has ruled that that right doesn't exist in South Africa. Gun ownership in law is a privilege and it is restricted. But the folks from the various different gun organizations, hunters associations, sports shooters, etc., were all using the language of the Second Amendment and pushing an ideology that has come from the US, not just by osmosis, that's happened too, but from the very deliberate efforts of the National Rifle Association to influence our policies and debates here in South Africa. And we know that's true around the world, right? Whether it's Australia or Canada or all sorts of places. So I come with that very particular experience today of feeling the influence of the US gun lobby. So let me park that there for a second. Hearing all of you talk, and Elizabeth, your very moving presentation of the ways in which gun violence affects the Caribbean, Eugenio, your work on Mexico, other parts of the Americas, you would think that our leading global health organization would have a robust, proactive plan to address gun violence. And that's what a group of us who met in Geneva last year to look at a related issue, which was gender exploitative marketing of guns. Next slide, please. We brought together a number of people for a meeting in Geneva, and one of the recommendations was that we look at what the WHO had done to regulate exploitative marketing of weapons. And you'll see people there, a number of people from organizations represented here. And so we decided we were going to do a study to look at the extent to which the World Health Organization had regulated the marketing of guns, assuming that they had done that in the same way that they have regulated baby formula marketing or the marketing of tobacco, alcohol, etc. Next slide, please. So after about a year of research, and I'll talk a little bit about the methodology, in the end conducted and published by 7 organizations, the Gender Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Steve's Comprehensive Injury Center, the University of Cape Town School of Public Health, Paz in Brazil, Gun Free South Africa here in South Africa, and WNAD in Trinidad and Tobago. And what we did was we analyzed the extent to which the WHO has focused on guns at all, because the truth we found out quite quickly was that there had been no regulation of gun marketing. Next slide, please. Next slide. And so we analyzed, and I think it was the first time that anyone had done this, all nearly 3,500 World Health Assembly resolutions to look at the extent to which they had dealt with gun violence. And while they have dealt with violence as a public health issue, we were sort of astonished to see that not a single resolution has addressed gun violence. In fact, not a single resolution even mentions gun violence in any specific way. We then analyzed all of the WHO publications over the last 25 years to look at how the violence prevention, the emergency medicine, and the commercial determinants of health publications addressed this issue. And what we saw was this really interesting and quite stark trend where gun violence was recognized as a major issue to address when it comes to violence prevention in the early 2000s. And then it dropped away almost to nothing over the last 10 years. And we looked at key WHO violence prevention frameworks, the INSPIRE framework on violence against children, the RESPECT framework on violence against women, and we looked at a number of documents in the Americas. Next slide, please. And remarkably, given what Elizabeth and Laura and Eugenio were just describing, the Pan American Health Organization also has documents that you would absolutely expect gun violence to be in and aren't, right? So the Health of Adolescents and Youth in the Americas doesn't mention guns. The PAHO Strategic Plan for 2020 to 2025 doesn't mention guns. The Masculinities and Men's Health in the Caribbean has no mention of guns. And so, you know, we spoke to about 20 experts to try and understand what that was. And we, in the end, had very helpful conversations with colleagues at the WHO. And of course, the WHO is alert to the extent of the problem, but they do not have often the political space or the resources to draw attention to this. And I do want to reiterate that colleagues at the WHO have been enormously supportive of this research and the recommendations that follow. And so I'm going to turn to those in just a second. Next slide, please. We identified a series of gaps, right? But the corollary of those gaps is absolutely a series of opportunities. And those opportunities are perhaps particularly timely, given that the US has withdrawn from the World Health Organization and therefore is at least less likely to interfere openly. We also have the Lancet Commission on Global Gun Violence and Health, which is pushing the world of public health to address gun violence more directly. We've got a number of big conferences next year, the Safety 2026 conference happening here in Cape Town. And we've increasingly got whether it's in Europe, Australia, the UK, number of different places, Brazil, increasingly strict regulations around digital marketing, and in some places, including guns. And then last major opportunity for WHO action is the forthcoming WHO World Report on Commercial Determinants of Health. The recent World Report on Social Determinants of Health, we were disappointed didn't address gun violence at all. But we've heard that the Commercial Determinants Report will. So we think we're sitting at a moment of significant opportunity. Next slide, please. So we established this global coalition for WHO action on firearm violence. Next slide, please. And we, in the space of a month, have managed to get support from over 50 organizations from 17 countries around the world, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, North America, Latin America, and Oceania. So everywhere is the bottom line. And that's happened very, very quickly. Next slide, please. And we have in our report and on our website come up with a series of essentially asks to the WHO. The first is to reestablish firearm violence as a public health priority within the organization and across its member states. The second is to consolidate that in the form of a World Health Assembly resolution. If there is a resolution, the WHO then has a mandate and must do something on this issue. Next slide, please. Now, Steve and Elizabeth have talked about the impact of gun violence on healthcare systems. We're saying to the WHO, they have an opportunity and a role to play in providing guidance to member states on the continuum of care from the first responder all the way through to the social workers and the community activists who will deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, deal with the root causes of gun violence. And then we're asking the WHO to integrate firearm violence into its other prevention work, including the frameworks I mentioned a moment ago. Next slide, please. And I think here we really want to see the WHO focus on gun violence as a commercial determinant of health. There is a growing body of work on that. This very clearly fits in that. Lastly, I just want to turn to what those of you on this call can do. Next slide, please. So we're asking for organizations to join the global coalition, to endorse the call to engage in advocacy with the WHO. Next slide. And we're asking for those of you who have the ability to engage your government, to get your government to consider tabling language that can go before the WHO's executive board next year and lead to a World Health Assembly resolution. And we're calling on everyone to amplify the message and to make gun violence a public health priority across all of our institutions and, of course, within the World Health Organization that shapes so much of what happens within the world of public health. So I realize I'm over. I'm really sorry, but I hope this was helpful and look forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dean. Fabulous presentation and a lot of very concrete actions that can be taken in there. For those who are on the call, on the session, please put your questions in the Q&A. While they're coming in, let me ask all of the speakers and even those in the first session who are still with us, Laura, Matt, and Eugenio. Let me ask each of you, and we'll go down the line. What is the one thing that can be done right now to secure political action to stop the illegal flow of weapons from the U.S. South? One thing, and I'll start with our group first, and then we'll go backwards with that. So, Elizabeth Burke, please, if you go first, that would be great. Then we'll go to Elizabeth Ward, Dean, and then we'll go to Steve, Laura, Matt, and Eugenio.
think one of the keys is really electing legislatures in the United States who understand that the Second Amendment is not implicated in these issues in any way, that this is illegal firearms trafficking, that the gun industry is profiting from, the dealers that are selling these guns know and understand. There's all sorts of evidence that shows that, including time to crime, multiple sales. So legislatures who have the backbone to take away some of these special protections that the gun industry has enjoyed would be extremely helpful.
Great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Ward.
I think if we strengthen the data collection systems and decrease the time of tracing and had the data clearly stated, I think we do know that Miami-Dade and Broward are major areas, and Georgia. Let's try and deal with that clearly and make the US look good. Because if we reduce the flow out there, work is being done to reduce the utilization in country. I think we could make the US government feel that they are, helping the Caribbean. They can look better in the Caribbean, and we would significantly benefit. What we do at the wars in Jamaica can be strengthened, and a lot more technology can be used. For example, they say, anyway, I'm going into detail. But I was just going to say that something like auto part cars are commonly in containers, are commonly known to be a source of where guns come into the country, and also that the scanners at the ports are often turned off because there's no independent management and monitoring, and a lot of pressure can be put on the operators of the scanners, which is something that I think we could all together make a big difference.
Great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Dean, please.
Yeah, it's a tough time to imagine being effective with this administration, but I do think international pressure, in the same way that, for instance, in the US, there is now a different understanding of the right to parental leave that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago in the US. And I think that is the result of a global conversation about how widespread parental leave is in other countries. And so I do think a better understanding and more pressure from other countries to say the US really is an outlier when it comes to its insistence on the production of weapons that they know are traveling well beyond their borders and do very little to regulate. So I think international pressure, speaking from my capacity within the Global Coalition for WHO Action, has, some chance of putting pressure on public opinion in the US, I should say.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. That's really important. One of the things, and I'll go to Steve after this, we've lamented this, just the lack of awareness in the public is really shocking, and maybe that's part of, I think, our challenge. And number two, another point you made, this is not a Second Amendment issue. It is not a Second Amendment issue. And finally, the status quo is benefiting the few at the expense of the many. So with that, I just want to turn it over to you, Steve. Then we're going to go to Laura, then Matt, then Eugenio. Steve, please.
Thank you. And just to build on the tremendous comments already been made, I think getting national interests from the Caribbean that Elizabeth Ward mentioned, the outside pressures that Becky Burke has been referencing, and the coalition that Dean and I and others are working on, getting member nations of WHO, getting them to come forward and saying, we need to address this in a comprehensive way through the resolution, through resources. We need to have that national set of countries some of them are scared that gun violence is going to be increasing. They want to be participants. There's countries that are already experiencing these terrible events. They want to also do something about it too. And again, to your point, Keith, this is not about Second Amendment. This is about a product. It's movement across countries, across borders, and this has got to be regulated in a way that's public health oriented, as we've talked about throughout this seminar.
Thanks very much, Steve. Those are really practical points that we need to keep driving forward. That will go to Laura. Laura, please, any comments that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what everybody else said, and I think for me, it's a two-part effort, right? I do think that internationally, we can do a better job of communicating to our populations in our countries about the harm. And so because if they are also building the pressure on their elected officials and they are aware of this, there's kind of we have a competing narrative that we're on a time clock to beat. And that is the narrative of those who sell the guns, who are very good at marketing the guns by saying, look how unsafe your country is. Get a gun to protect yourself. And so I do think that we need to talk about those dynamics internationally. And finally, I do think also that there are specific groups within the United States that could really make a difference. For example, Latinos who have family members in these countries, right? Latinos are a very important voting bloc. And if we could start a real conversation about how this affects not just their families if they have them there, but the possibility of and again, there's a competing narrative, like these immigrants are bad. They're not good immigrants like you, right? And there are so there are these competing narratives that we're kind of on the clock to try to counter, but it really does start with raising awareness and spreading the conversation in our circles, whether we're abroad or here in the United States.
Yeah, and if I may just do a follow-up, I mean, we're going to the road of scapegoating migrants, which is just so deplorable, that behavior. But on the mobilizing the private sector, they pay a huge cost, right? They're paying health insurance companies, healthcare providers, and the scions of the private sector. This costs them. Nobody's benefiting from those who can influence the president. How can we get those people on board? Because I just think this is just a missed opportunity. Is it?
I mean, I think there are a couple ways. And again, this is, you were better at politics than probably anybody on this panel, Keith. But I think there's a messaging, like right now, there's a narrative of all these billionaires are getting benefits on the backs of you and your taxpayer dollars, right? And perhaps there's the narrative to be changed about, okay, well, who gets injured the most by firearm violence? Mostly people who are on the margins, people who are economically disadvantaged, and many of them who don't have insurance. And there are costs that need to be repaid from the public money for those costs. And I do think that like the harm of quantifying the harm to what it costs the people of XY country to pay for those harms out of their money, not out of somebody else's kindness. I think that's really important to highlight.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Laura. Matt, please, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so we're not an advocacy organization, so I haven't thought much about, or I don't have any official institutional positions on how to shape the narrative or how to influence politics. But I will say, from an operational perspective, there are a couple things. We need to prioritize screening of outbound shipments of goods, of commodities, as rigorously as we do inbound. We tend to focus on inbound, and the resource allocation reflects that. That's got to change. Secondly, the investigations of arms trafficking, those take years, and oftentimes there are several controlled purchases over the course of months or years that are required before they can build the case. That's too long because while that's occurring, there's still trafficking, or there could still be trafficking by these networks. So Identifying, investigating, and dismantling these trafficking networks needs to be a priority. The resource allocation needs to reflect that. The mandate needs to reflect that. And we've got to find some way of expediting the gathering of evidence necessary to pull the plug on these outfits. There's many more, but I'll stop with those two.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Matt. Much appreciated. And finally, go to Eugenio. Are you on, Eugenio?
He had to leave
Oh, okay.
with other commitments.
That's great. Well, thanks for letting me know, Steve. So I just like, for those of you who are still on, I'd like to really thank you for being here. I'd like to thank our wonderful presenters. I'd like to thank Dr. Steve Hargarten, who has always been such a. Oh, Laura, you want to say something?
Actually, there's a question for Dean about gender-based violence and firearms in South Africa in the Q&A. Sorry.
Oh, no, thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. So Heba has a question for Dean. Gender-based violence and femicide was finally declared as a national disaster in South Africa recently. What data trends did you notice in your research about the correlation of gun violence and gender-based violence? Dean, please.
Sure, Keith. I actually responded. I don't know if you can see the response. It's in the answered column.
Great.
And, very, very briefly, gun violence hasn't been adequately recognized. It isn't, for instance, mentioned in our gender-based violence national strategic plan, although our femicide prevention strategy does have a mention of guns and gun violence. There is, I think, some momentum towards changing that and strengthening the focus. At the University of Cape Town, we are hoping to embark on a study that looks at the reticence of some of the more traditional GBV and child abuse prevention focused organizations to deal with gun violence. Part of that has to do in South Africa with a very strong drive for criminal legal responses rather than upstream violence prevention. But I think, and I come from a long history of doing work on gender-based violence here in South Africa and in the US. And I would say it has been a blind spot of sorts. The recent interministerial meeting that happened in Bogota on violence against children generated something like 90 country commitments, none of which mention gun violence, despite the fact that gun violence is the leading cause for death in a number of countries in the Americas. So there's a lack of attention to these issues, which I think we are beginning to shine a light on and push for attention to. So I hope that answers the question. And it's a great question, Hiva. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dean, and for a really shocking and grotesque other situations. The number of women who were sexually assaulted on the way north from Latin America into the United States. I mean, Lori, probably correct me, I think it's 40%, maybe more. It is a shocking, deplorable, appalling, I mean, words cannot begin to describe that, but those folks are leaving to save their lives. A driver of this is that what we're talking about here is the sale of weapons by a relatively small number of groups. 5%, I think, was mentioned, of gun dealers are sending 90% of these weapons south of the border. And you've heard today the human cost, the economic cost, the destabilizing of states. It's a lose-lose-lose proposition. Fixing it is in our hands. So in a parting request from all of you who are on here, please look at the organizations that have been working on this. There's a lot of legislation in Congress that can have a major impact upon this. So it's up to all of us, I think, to inform the public, inform policymakers. The public drives the political. So let's speak out to the public, inform folks who really don't know very little about this. Come to our conference in Washington next April 9th to the 12th. You'll meet some of the amazing speakers that we have today. Work with them, work and support their organizations, and together we can make a difference. This session is going to be up on our website in 2 weeks. Please share it widely with your colleagues and networks. And again, much thanks to all of you for being here. Much thanks to our speakers. Thank you, Dr. Hargarten, again for co-leading this. And big thanks to Norma Verona in our office who produces this and makes sure we're on the straight and narrow track. With that, thanks everybody. Stay safe, keep well.
Thank you.
Thank